guys, and welcome to another video. So even though this is coming out in January, I still wanted to have the festive spirit because this is going to be about the books that I've read in the month of December. So I have my Christmas lights, I have my Christmas trees, I have my Christmas lights necklace that I love and wear during the holidays, and I think that will get us in a good festive mood. If you're new to my channel, I like to make YouTube videos with my reactions and my thoughts to books that I read. I read a lot of fiction, books by women, sci-fi, and because I'm based here in Singapore, I've been reading one book about Singapore per month for the past year or so, and that is a tradition that I want to continue in 2021. So the first book I'm going to talk about is called The Uncanny Valley by Anna Weiner. It came out in 2020, and it's a memoir where Anna really talks about her experience and her observations working in Silicon Valley in the 2010 era. This is a book that was recommended to me by a couple different people, I think because a lot of my own gripes or rants that I might have around tech bros or tech culture sounded pretty similar to what Anna writes about in her memoir. Overall, I enjoyed it, I think, for that reason. I went into this book kind of thinking, okay, is it just a slam piece? Is it gonna be, it's like so hip to criticize tech these days. And I think what pleasantly surprised me is the fact that Anna comes from the East Coast. She comes from the publishing industry where she started out as like a publishing assistant. And so it's different from someone who goes to San Francisco and has kind of already drunk the Kool-Aid and really buys into all of the like hype and idolizing tech as a panacea for all of society's ills and problems. And it really more kind of describes just her culture shock. And I think that resonates with me because even though I grew up in Kentucky, I feel like culturally I identify more with East Coast culture, I guess. And so when I went to California for school, it was kind of that same culture shock of just being exposed to this whole different mindset where success isn't getting into a consulting firm or working for the government or joining a think tank like maybe it is at the Ivy League schools. It's dropping out and starting a startup, or it's joining a VC, and just kind of the whole different value system and the mindset is pretty stark. I think the difference is pretty stark. And so the reason I think I related really well to this memoir is some of those things that Anna felt when she moved out to San Francisco, I also felt when I moved out to California for university. I think there are two really strong points of this book. The first is what I kind of mentioned before, is she does a really good job of capturing the feeling of being in San Francisco during this time period. The writing is very snappy and descriptive, and even though she doesn't call out companies by name, you can pick up from her writing, like you can put together who she's talking about. And then the second is she really does identify some key themes and unpacks them a little bit. Some ideas like just the ahistorical nature of technology's companies' approach to certain problems. She talks about platform responsibility from when she worked at GitHub, which obviously now is a huge topic, especially since Trump got kicked off Twitter and Facebook. But I think at the time, she was really witnessing the very beginning of it. So that was also really interesting to kind of see her point of view into that very nascent stage of when all of these problems start to unfold. And the fact that a lot of the growth in Silicon Valley comes from creating software, and that really just exists in this intangible space. One thing that she captures really well is when you're in this environment, the kind of personal and individual level need to do something tangible and with your hands, and to feel like you're either biohacking your own body, or you're working on woodworking, or you take up like camping, or like all of these hobbies, or like you ride your fixie bike around, like all these hobbies that Silicon Valley millennials have picked up. I do think she does a good job of kind of drawing that connection between that feeling and the fact that most of these people just sit for hours, day in and day out, working on code or responding to tickets or triaging certain things that customers want. And the fact that all of this growth kind of occurs in a quote unquote intangible space, I don't know if that's any different than if you're like in academia or different industries, but I think there is something kind of unique about that alienation or dissociation from your labor that has resulted in this culture and these various like habits and behaviors that people have picked up. And she does a really good job of describing that at a granular level through her own experiences and what she's observed, but then kind of also tying it to a broader phenomenon. Yeah, and I really like her style of writing. It's, I think, a common style for writing a memoir, but it's just very descriptive in a specific way, which makes it feel like A, it resonates with my own experience of those things, and B, like you're there, like it just feels very vivid. The other thing that really resonated with me, just as like a very minor detail, is the fact that there are no seasons in Northern California. And in Singapore, there are no seasons as well. I mean, maybe in a more drastic way because we're basically on the equator. But during college, I remember just being weirded out a little bit by not having fall or winter because time just passes by in a much different way. Like it's harder to keep track of it. She kind of ties that to the overall culture and the overall environment, both like psychologically and physically. So she says, Northern California did not offer a natural human experience of the passage of time. I was confused by the abundance of post-colonial, non-native flora. I was always eating expired yogurts. I was always actively trying to recall the season. I hadn't seen rain in 3 years. It was no wonder San Francisco was referred to as a city of Peter Pans. No wonder so many people tried to live in the perpetual present. It was easy to forget that anyone was getting older or that anyone ever would. I think it's the kind of language that can seem kind of overboard if you didn't actually live it a little bit and experience it. I'm kind of on the periphery, but I think certain descriptions like that, it just really resonated with me, and I just think it's accurate. I would recommend this book for anyone that is in the tech industry, works at Facebook, Google, any of those, but also people like me who maybe originally, I was like a liberal arts major, really thought I was gonna do something very liberal artsy, but then kind of ended up on this tech path, and you might have like some remembrance of experiences or culture shock from that journey. I think that's the memoir. This is the memoir that you would really find a lot to relate to. And especially if you're a woman in tech, I think it'll be kind of comforting or satisfying to hear Anna so snappily and vividly describe maybe some of the same experiences that you've gone through. I will give this a 4.2 out of 5. Mostly, it's just enjoyable to read. I think I do really like the style of writing that is descriptive but specific, to the point, and I think especially memoirs come off really well when they're written in that way. The second book I am going to talk about is called Severance by Ling Ma. This was released in 2018, and my friend Anna Gu recommended it to me, so thank you, Anna, for the recommendation. This is yet another book that takes place during a global pandemic. In 2020, I also read The End of October by Lawrence Wright and Station 11 by Elizabeth St. Mandel John, and I started to think that I was just being ridiculous reading all these books that take place during a global pandemic, But now I think it's less that I'm being ridiculous and more that there's a general trend of these books coming to the fore, obviously, because of coronavirus. So I have one more book I'm gonna read that takes place during a global pandemic, but after that, I'm gonna have a moratorium on that subject matter, I think. I guess just to give you a little bit of the plot, she recounts some memories from her life before the pandemic happens, and she interweaves personal reflections, and she also talks about her relationship with her boyfriend But then in the present day, it's the story of her leaving New York City as it becomes overwhelmed with the fevered population and meeting up with a group of people and trying to make it to somewhere safer. The group of people that she meets up with also have kind of a religious fervor to them, which is similar to what happens in Station 11, but whatever, I was kind of take it or leave it. That didn't really impact me much. I don't think it was like that meaningful to the plot. This does take place during a global pandemic, but it's actually more a book that reflects on the immigrant experience in the US and also the experience of capitalism. Maybe just one quote to really sum up her commentary on urban capitalist living. She says, "To live in a city is to take part in and to propagate its impossible systems. To wake up, to go to work in the morning. It is also to take pleasure in those systems, because otherwise, who could repeat the same routines year in, year out?" I don't really find it to be a plot-driven book, so there are some kind of weird things that happen in the plot, and I don't think the pacing is spectacular, but really the strong suit of this book is the articulation of the anxieties of the main character as she navigates this world where a flu called the Shen fever, which originated in China, has taken over the whole world except for very cold areas where they've been kind of protected by the climate. And what happens is you become fevered and you lose your sentience, or you lose your consciousness, right? But you still perform your daily activities over and over until you kind of like rot away or someone kills you, but you've lost any of your humanity. And so that premise right off the bat is kind of a commentary on the fact that capitalism has put us into these routines, and how many of us who operate in this economic system have very tedious and rote lives, but because it's so tied to our livelihood and our economic welfare, we place such importance on it. And I think that's one of the key struggles that the main character goes through, is the fact that she knows that it's meaningless, but also because she's trapped in it, she has to give it meaning. And one plot point that kind of illustrates that is, even though every single person in her company that she works at, and also in New York City where she lives, has essentially become sick or fevered, she still goes into work. And she agrees to sign this contract with her company where she'll be like the last person overseeing the office. And she has this drive or this commitment to her routine and to her economic labor that causes her to continue to work day in and day out, even though society is crumbling around her. And why is she like that? I think it really ties to the immigrant part of the story. The immigrant mindset that you always have to be useful. And obviously, like immigrants that go to the US, first generation especially, have something to prove, or they want to be upstanding citizens. But it's not just they don't want to run afoul of the law, it's that through their economic labor, again, like through their work, through their industriousness, that's how they provide value. And so that's like kind of the tie-in between working hard and like morality, like being a good person. And especially if you just think about the title of this book, severance actually means to sever, right? It's like a cutting of ties. And I think that really plays into the idea of the immigrant experience and where is home, and either consciously or unconsciously cutting those ties. And especially during times of crisis, which is another thing I loved about this book, is, yeah, there was this pandemic, but also there's a hurricane or like a very intense storm that happens in New York City. And one of the characters says, like, 9/11 has happened, like all these horrible things happen. What's another thing. Like the fact that we've almost become numb to all of these disasters happening, that the global pandemic almost doesn't even feel that jarring to our existing condition, especially under capitalism. The only other thing I'll comment on is the writing style, which is very specific. Like she'll say like, I Googled this, or she'll name like specific restaurants, she'll name specific corporations. And I think that does a very good job of tying it to a specific moment and place, which is important to this whole idea of like the human condition under capitalism. I think that kind of makes it feel more like alienating and more dystopian, the fact that she names all these products really specifically. I will give it a 4.2 out of 5. I really enjoyed the writing style and just kind of the feel of it, like the flow of it, I think is also very aligned to me as like the main demographic of someone who would enjoy this book. And so far, the best book that I read that takes place during a global pandemic. The book that I read about Singapore this month is Lee Kuan Yew's memoir. I think he wrote 3. This is the last one. It covers the years 1965 to 2000. It's called From Third World to First, The Singapore Story. It came out in 2000, which was interesting because it's already 20 years out of date. And so it really did make me wonder, what would LKY think about the current world today, especially the rise of the internet and information economy and the global pandemic. I really thought I needed to read something that was the official story, because pretty much everything I read in 2020 was some type of alternative viewpoint, which is great and interesting, but I realized I do kind of need the official party line as a starting point, or like a backdrop to be reading all of this alternative stuff and criticism as well. And what better than literally Lee Kuan Yew's memoir. I really enjoyed it. I think he's a great writer. I definitely am in the same camp as him when it comes to be concise and just say what you mean. The chapters are very short and he is unrestrained. So I really appreciated the writing style. The book is really long though. I think it's like 600 pages, 700 pages. It's also hilarious in several points just because Lee Kuan Yew is so matter of fact. If you don't know, Lee Kuan Yew was Prime Minister of Singapore for several decades and also the founder of the People's Action Party, the PAP, which has been the main party in power in Singapore since its inception. And he definitely has a reputation of doing whatever he wants, especially when it comes to this ideology of East versus West. He is well known for saying, I have Confucian values, and that certain systems like freedom of press or democracy won't necessarily take root as quickly in societies or countries with Asian values or Confucian values. He says right off the bat in like the first chapter, I want to be correct, not politically correct. So there's definitely little jibes that he makes, especially towards Americans or Western sets of ideals, that are hilarious because they're just so trolly, like, and it's his memoir, so he can do it. And I think it's nothing new to Singaporeans, but as an American, it's like very hilarious to read. And the other thing that's really funny is when he talks about meeting all of these various leaders and heads of state, and he's just so matter of fact in his appraisal of them. So he'll just say like, XYZ was like not very intelligent. And he also does that kind of old school thing, which I don't really think is politically correct these days, of describing everyone's appearance. And so he'll say like, you know, this head of Indonesia or whoever was rotund, but very capacious in his intellect. Like he'll just have these one sentence descriptions that are so matter of fact, and some of them are not nice. And so that was also hilarious to read. This memoir is separated into two main sections. The first section is inward looking and talks about how Lee Kuan Yew subdued the communists and created an independent nation. It talks about the separation from Malaysia, and that to me was the best part of the memoir. If someone asked me, do you recommend it? I would really just read it for that first half. Maybe it's because I'm so interested in Singapore, it's just content that I prefer, but to hear his point of view is really interesting, especially the chapter on the communists. If you guys remember, I read a graphic novel called The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai, which really is the alternative viewpoint of how the communists were trying to do certain things in Singapore, but then were snuffed out by Lee Kuan Yew. And obviously in Lee Kuan Yew's memoir, he describes them as very different. And that's a constant theme, is like his effort to subdue communism, to fight the influence of the Chinese Communist Party within Southeast Asia, and also the Malayan Communist Party. I mean, honestly, say what you will about Lee Kuan Yew, but he is an extraordinary man. And all of his efforts to create Singapore when it was just such a tiny nation, not recognized by most. I mean, China didn't even recognize Singapore as an independent sovereign country till much later, like maybe the 70s, late 70s, don't quote me on that, but they were still saying the people of Singapore instead of the country of Singapore well into that time period. And so I do think it's overplayed to a certain extent because it's part of the mythology of the PAP, but at the same time, it really was a very dire situation, and the ingenuity and the resourcefulness and the scrappiness of LKY and his ministers is just amazing. Like, I'm so lazy, I can never do that. Like, he just was tireless and so committed to what he thought was the right way of doing things and to his worldview of geopolitics and political structures in Asia, but also worldwide. The second part of the book just becomes more of a diary. Each chapter is on his relations with different countries, starting from 1970-ish to 2000. The whole second half is really just him showing off like how much everyone revered his opinion. It's not overdone, but you definitely can tell that he's trying to set his legacy as a position of, you know, consultative power. Like, everyone wanted to hear LKY's view, which I'm sure is true to a certain extent. And I really do think LKY was a total powerhouse, but also it's just crazy to think about because Singapore is so small. So much of how Singapore runs today is really Lee Kuan Yew's imprint and really based on these very strongly held opinions that he has around Chinese education, or like how the races should work together, or trying to build up a financial center. And that to me is super fascinating. It's also really interesting to hear him describe the currency crisis of 1997 and all of like the kind of key milestones and his thinking around that. That's also an interesting event that's covered in this memoir. I will give this a 4 out of 5. I think if you're doing what I'm doing, which is I have this whole project of trying to get kind of a 360 view of Singaporean politics and history and society, you kind of have to read Lee Kuan Yew's memoir. Like, you're not going to be able to understand this country without understanding him. I don't know if I'm going to read the rest of the volumes. I think I will, but maybe in 7 months or so, or maybe that'll be my December book for 2021, because it's kind of a lot to get through, but I think it's essential if you're gonna try to understand Singapore. The last book is a really fun one. It's called Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. It came out in 2002. It's a really long book. That's kind of my main gripe, is that there's way too much description, but it's called Dickensian, like of the style of Charles Dickens by a lot of people, and his books were also really long, so I kind of feel like that's just the genre that she's operating in. But it takes place during Victorian era Britain, and it follows a girl, I guess, a young woman who is a fingersmith. So she works for a family or like a group of petty criminals, and so fingersmith means like thief. This book is a wild ride. I'm definitely not going to describe the plot because there's so many twists and turns and like jaw-dropping moments, and it's extremely plot driven. If you're the kind of person who likes historical fiction or books that are really like kind of murder mystery style, like books that are really driven by plot twists and turns, this is for you. I'll give you a little bit of the premise of the book, but I don't want to say too much because I feel like anything I say could potentially spoil this, and I'm really bad at spoilers. Like I'll even flip to the end of the book or accidentally Google stuff, but I managed to not spoil anything for myself in this book, and there are really some jaw-dropping moments. So that if that's something that you love, you should pick this up because I think the character development and the building of the plot really leads to some great payout. I'll just say you follow this young woman named Sue, who is the Fingersmith, as she tries to do this big con. And in the course of the con, a love story develops, and it's a very unique and beautiful love story. And overall, you get a lot of passion, both in the events leading up to the con and how that works out, as well as the relationship between the characters. So I feel like that's as much as I can say without spoiling anything. The writing style is very descriptive, sometimes too descriptive, but kind of the level of description where if you skim a paragraph or two, you'll be okay, like you won't miss too much. Sometimes she'll describe the same thing from a different point of view, and that is really artful, the way that she does that. I read this with my book club, and we decided to watch a movie that was based on this book, and the movie is called The Handmaiden. And what's really interesting is they changed the time and place. It takes place during the interwar period, like between World War I and World War II in Japanese occupied Korea. So they changed like the culture and the country and the time period, but still the movie like really captures the essence and the main gist of the book, which I just thought was so cool to adapt something but also create something completely new. And I love when different media or even the same media really riff off each other, because I feel like that is when you can, you know, like references even. Like when you refer to stuff, you're already building so many layers of meaning. And sometimes you don't get it because you don't know the reference, but in this case, we read the book and then watched the movie. And so I highly recommend doing that. Those are all the books that I read in the month of December. Thank you for joining me over the course of 2020 as I ticked this off my bucket list and finally started a YouTube channel. It's been so much fun, and I'm planning to do it this year as well. So I will see you in January for a January 2021 books review. But until then, happy holidays and Happy New Year.